Do not heed the words of the Jedi Council. The Republic will fall if we do not act now. Already the Mandalorians have taken 3 systems along the Rim. They will only grow more powerful with time. Come stand with me. We will use our might to help the Republic in its time of need. Join Revan and I. Together, we will battle this menace.
Hey there, welcome to the Lord to Death podcast. My name's Brett, and today we're going to dive back into a galaxy far, far away by popular demand and explore some of the lore behind Star Wars Knights of the Old Republic. I got a couple comments on the KOTOR episode I did asking for more, and here it is. I figured this is the best place to start since I went over most of the plot of KOTOR, plus I think this is far more interesting. So what we're going to do is cover the prelude to KOTOR and go over the Mandalorian Wars, where the Mandalorians took a foothold in the galaxy and threatened to raise the core worlds. I think that with the rising popularity of The Mandalorian and the Book of Boba Fett, this is a good look into what the Mandalorians really were before the events of the movies and shows. In those, we see Mandalorians as this fringe group consisting of bounty hunters and religious fanatics, which is pretty far from where they got their roots as what I can only describe as space Vikings. If you're not familiar with this era of Mandalorians, you'll understand what I mean soon enough. A couple things before I start. I apologize for my voice. It is peak ragweed season, so my allergies are suffering. But also, I think it's important to set the scene with the state of the galaxy and where the Sith, Jedi, Mandalorians, and Republic are currently sitting. The start of this conflict was in 3976 BBY, during the Old Republic and before the High Republic, and of course, several thousand years before the movies. This specific point in time was where the Sith and Mandalorians had been pushed back and forced into hiding for a number of years. The Galactic Republic stood as the reigning faction in the galaxy, with the Jedi as their right hand as keepers of the peace. It's worth noting that the Jedi, at this time, while seeing themselves as the keepers of the peace, did everything in their power not to intervene in the wars of the Republic unless there was a looming Sith threat. That tidbit is very important to the coming events. About 20 years before this point, there was the Great Sith War, where the Dark Lord Freedon Nad was found influencing politics on the planet Onderon, which is going to be a pretty key planet here, with the help of Exar Kun, that led to a full assault on Coruscant in an attempt to break the foothold that the Republic and the Jedi had on the galaxy. Together, the Jedi and the Republic were able to drive back the Sith, defeat Exar Kun, and force the Sith into hiding. During this time, there was another Sith by the name of Ulic Qel-Droma, who was able to earn the Mandalorians' trust by defeating their leader, Mandalore the Indomitable, and led the Mandalorians in an assault on Onderon in an attempt to put them in charge of the planet. They rode into the planet from orbit on their Basilisk war droids, which were a semi-sentient combat droid designed by the Basiliscan race, and they began to, as the Mandalorians do, raise, pillage, and repeat. The sudden arrival of the Republic's fleet quickly turned the war against their favor, and the Mandalorians were forced to retreat on their Basilisk war droids to Onderon's forest moon, Duxon, where Mandalore's Basilisk was shot down and he was devoured by creatures on the moon's surface. At this time, there was no Darksaber ritual that you would see in the Clone Wars, Rebels, and The Mandalorian. At this time, there was Mandalore's mask. If you wore the mask, the other Mandalorians would generally accept you as their leader. The one who wore the mask was called Mandalore, and usually one would win the mask in a duel to the death with Mandalore for the title. But in cases like this, where Mandalore's mask was abandoned with his body, the Mandalorian who found his corpse and wore the mask would be recognized as their leader. Also, at this time, the predominant race of the Mandalorians was the Twang, and I hope I'm pronouncing that right because it's only ever in writing, it's never spoken, I don't think. And they were a large humanoid species that was native to Coruscant, originally, that was driven from their homeworld and forced to find a new home. Their leader, at the time, was named Mandalore, who led the Twangs to a new planet where they slew giant mythosaurs, and roamed the surface and tamed the wild planet. They called their new home Mandalore, and dubbed themselves Mandalorians, or Mandoade, which meant sons and daughters of Mandalore. And of course they did so in the name of the one who led them there. I know that might seem like a little bit of a tangent, but the Twang being the predominant species of the Mandalorians is an important bit of backstory. During this period between the Great Sith War and the Mandalorian Wars, the Mandalorians were defeated and largely scattered into clans across the galaxy. The Sith were in hiding, and the Republic was ushering in an era of peace with the Jedi at their side. That was until 20 years later when the Sith would once again ally themselves with the Mandalorians and begin their next galactic conquest. 2 years prior, in 3978 BBY, the current Mandalore, dubbed Mandalore the Ultimate, was approached by a member of the Sith species. And yes, if you didn't know, there was a race before the title of Sith was given to anyone who commanded the dark side of the Force. They were a large, red-skinned, tentacle-having people, they were pretty cool actually, who enlisted Mandalore's help in locating the tomb of his master's rival on the planet Rekyad. Upon discovering the tomb, the mysterious emissary told Mandalore of a vision that his master had experienced of the Mandalorians sweeping across the galaxy and conquering countless worlds against the Republic before ultimately crushing them underfoot and taking control. Mandalore, being a Mandalorian, didn't need much convincing past the words glory and indiscriminate murder. But he was also unaware that the Sith emissary was a servant of the Sith Emperor and that he was being manipulated through the Force. The emissary had one goal in mind: use the Mandalorians as a weapon against the Republic to test and weaken their defenses so that the Sith could come in and finish the job, conquering the galaxy. Mandalore the Ultimate, under the Sith's control, began rallying Mandalorian clans in preparation for the impending war. He returned to Mandalorian space and began reforming the rules that Mandalorians were bound to. Firstly, they would begin to openly accept other non-Twang species into their ranks, so as to increase their numbers, so long as they were willing to accept the Mandalorian warrior code. Second, the Mandalorians were no longer to raid, pillage, and move on to the next settlement. They were to take up fortifications and hold their newly claimed territory as a Mandalorian settlement. The point was to create a new society that would uphold Mandalorian ideals, which was quite successful and part of the reason they were able to get so far. Their numbers swelled rapidly as they were dubbed the Neo-Crusader movement under Mandalore the Ultimate, with his right-hand man, Cassus Fett. And yes, that is the Fett that was predecessor to Jango and the Clone Army. Cassus Fett served as Mandalore's strategist and aide, helping to unite and build the Mandalorians under his name. Through holding territory and becoming a more unified force, the Mandalorians evolved during this period to a proper civilization that consisted of more than clans fighting for space. This made them more dangerous than ever before, but the movement happened slowly enough that the Republic was none the wiser, and it helps that they were doing all of this in Outer Rim territory, where the Republic had very little hold. After a couple years of rallying, that brings us back to 3976 BBY, the proper start of the Mandalorian Wars. A fleet of Neo-Crusader warships raided the planet Althir III in a battle that lasted 5 days. The Althiri were unexpectedly able to hold off the Mandalorian forces until a warrior by the name of Canderous Ordo broke a stalemate. If you've played KOTOR, then you'll recognize this fellow as the rough and gruff Mandalorian comrade that you can recruit in the Terrace Undercity. In fact, a lot of companions that we run into were part of the Mandalorian Wars. Canderous was tasked with taking the enemy flank in order to break their formation. However, he saw an opening and broke his orders by splitting his forces and forcing the Althiri to take an assault from several fronts, exposing their command ships and taking out the Althiri fleet, which was 10 times the size of their own. Being almost solely responsible for their victory, Canderous Ordo was rewarded with a clan of his own to command, dubbed Clan Ordo. The battle for Althir III was the first step in the Mandalorians building a massive war machine. In a short time, they were able to mobilize a force that was able to start taking on larger planets and even the Republic. 3 years later, in 3973 BBY, Cassus Fett led the Mandalorians to a planet called KOTOR, home to a feline species called, well, the KOTOR. Calling it a battle would imply that there was an objective resistance, but the KOTOR were woefully unprepared for the slaughter that was about to happen. There was one Mandalorian woman who protested the genocide and tried to stand in the way of the other Mandalorians, but was shot down almost immediately. And I don't mean metaphorically, they literally shot her and everyone she was trying to protect. Basilisk war droids scoured the surface of the planet, killing over 90% of the KOTOR population with only a few hundred survivors. This was enough to garner the attention of the Republic, who, upon hearing that the Mandalorians were back to their old antics, sent a fleet over to the Duxan Moon where the Mandalorians were last seen in the years prior. They also sent a fleet over to the planet Terrace, which conveniently sat along the trade route that the Mandalorians called the Mandalorian Road, which connected Mandalore to planets like Coruscant and the rest of the galaxy. Over the next several years, the Mandalorians would continue their conquest and expand their reach into Hutt space, along the eastern edge of the galaxy. They took control of trade routes along the Liana system, following them southeast to the Kael'ta and Florin system, and then finally taking it further south into the Taskid system, where they officially encroached on Hutt space by taking the Denagra and Durnatine systems. The Hutts, if you don't know, were a territorial folk, and resorted to hiring mercenaries to defend their space. The funny thing about mercenaries is that they can be easily bought out, and the ones who were tasked with defending the systems against the Mandalorian threat were coerced to work against the Hutts and join the Mandalorian ranks. The ones who did not were promptly killed. And with that, the Mandalorians were able to set up an outpost on the planet KOTOR as a forward operating base to invade the Mid-Rim. The Republic began to reinforce their fleet around Taris, with their supplying planets being threatened by the Mandalorians, as Taris would be the next reasonable target within the Mid-Rim. This blockade was able to stifle the Mandalorians' progress for a short period in 3965 BBY, already 11 years into the war. The Republic was able to stop the Mandalorians from a single victory for about 8 months before they were able to take the planet of Flashpoint, a weirdly named planet in the Star Wars galaxy. Flashpoint was repurposed for a fellow by the name of Demagol, who captured Jedi for experimentation to see where they got their powers from, so that the Mandalorians could try to harness their potential. Flashpoint and this laboratory are very important to the next little bit. Months after their victory on Flashpoint, the Mandalorian forces made an attempt to move forward and capture the planet Surja. There, they had an encounter with a Republic fleet under the command of Captain Saul Kareth, another important name in this war, who had under his command Cartho Nassi, your first permanent teammate in KOTOR. Because of Saul Kareth, this battle resulted in a stalemate over the next couple of months. With all this happening so close after the Sith were on a very similar warpath years earlier, you might be wondering, where are the Jedi in all of this? Well, I mentioned in the beginning of the episode that the Jedi were very anti-conflict at this time, and they did not want to get involved in any war that did not directly involve the Sith. While the Sith were pulling the strings in this war, no one could have known that at the time, and the Jedi were just biding their time. There is a lot that happens over the next couple years, so I'm going to try to be as concise as possible. I might leave out a couple things that don't directly influence the war, so if you're missing a couple little tidbits or battles, it's just because they weren't as important to the war overall. Because the Jedi Council was not getting involved in the war, there were some Jedi who believed that there was no other end to the conflict other than their involvement. These Jedi were led by one such man who advocated for Revanchism, which is defined as a policy of seeking to retaliate, especially to recover lost territory. This Jedi was none other than the one who would be called Revan later in the war, the protagonist of KOTOR. I'm going to refer to them as Revan, even though at this point that was not their title. What was their name, though? We don't know. Seeing as they were the protagonist of an RPG, it could be whatever you want it to be. And there's no canon name other than the title of Revan, which comes from the term Revanchist. I think canonically it makes sense that no one knew his true name except for those close to him. And considering his eventual fall to the dark side, it's reasonable to assume that the Jedi would have scrubbed his name from their records. Revan started the Jedi movement against the Mandalorians with the encouragement of his master, Kreia, and a group of like-minded Jedi like his friend Alec. The Council forbade them from getting involved, however, but they did so regardless at the risk of exile. The Revanchists stop at the Jedi Tower in Taris to see if they could sway the Masters and Padawans there to their cause, since they were so close to the war, but it ultimately ended in failure. They moved on to Surja, where they were ambushed and captured by Mandalorians and taken to Flashpoint, where they were tortured by Demagol in hopes of determining where the Jedi got their powers from. Shortly after this, there was something brewing at Taris that would change the war. The Masters had slew their apprentices at a false knighting ceremony. The Masters had a traumatic shared vision of the future where they saw not only their deaths, but the destruction of the Jedi Order and the Galactic Republic. This is a very strong theme throughout the Mandalorian Wars, is people having visions, misinterpreting them, and trying to prevent these visions from happening. In fact, this is a theme through all of the games and movies, pretty much. Look at what happened with Anakin. But these Masters believed that their Padawans would be the one to bring about this destruction, and so they struck them down in a preemptive strike. One of these Padawans, Zane Carrick, managed to escape the slaughter because he was late to his own knighting ceremony. Knowing what would happen if the news got out about Masters slaying their apprentices, the Masters put out a warrant for Carrick's capture, and blamed him for what would be known as the Padawan Massacre. Carrick managed to evade the police on Taris, which caused public unrest and distrust that the police could adequately keep the Jedi in check, which caused corporations like Losian Industries to pull out of Taris. This caused massive layoffs in the Taris Undercity, leading to extreme poverty and a rise in gang violence that would cause mass instability. On the same day as his escape, Carrick was caught by a bounty hunter and brought back to the Tower for judgment. The Jedi Masters informed Carrick of the reasoning behind the events of the massacre before killing the bounty hunter and attempting to finish off Carrick once and for all. However, a friend clad in red, named Gerald, came at just the right time to save Carrick, leaving the Masters with no choice but to admit failure in capturing the fugitive. This caused riots in Terrace in the Middle City, and these Jedi Masters were reassigned to separate postings because of the public's lack of respect for their authority after this incident. Once again, this seems like a weird tangent, but it is actually very important, as Zane Carrick is a pretty prominent character in the Mandalorian Wars. The unrest on Terrace and the Jedi's withdrawal from the planet left Mandalore the Ultimate with an opening to seize the planet. He ordered his forces to attack the planet Vanquo, ending the 8-month-long stalemate with the Republic fleet's defeat, as they headed back for Terrace. The Republic tried to pull their forces in the system back to form a blockade around Terrace, but they once again failed to form an adequate defense. Mandalorian dreadnoughts began an orbital bombardment of the planet, bringing devastation to the already unstable Terrace as they began their invasion. Zane Carrick, feeling pretty jaded about the Jedi, learned of a group of Crusaders who were taken captive at Flashpoint. He was able to convince the Mandalorians there that the Republic had booby-trapped their ships with explosives, and convince them to leave the station while he rescued the Jedi from Demagol. Demagol managed to swap armor with one of Carrick's crew, and managed to escape conviction. A man by the name of Roland Dyer was sent to Coruscant to pay for the crimes of Demagol. It is a ridiculous Scooby-Doo level plot point, but it is what it is. With the Mandalorians constantly clad in foot-to-toe armor, I guess it's easy for them to just put on another suit of armor and skedaddle. Remember kids, identity theft is not a joke. When the Revankists took who they believed to be Demagol back to Coruscant, they were hailed as heroes of the Republic for continuing their campaign to get the Jedi involved in the war. Specifically, Revan, as he was hailed as the Revankist. Revan began traveling around, spreading the word of the Revankists and rallying help to fight against the Mandalorian threat. One of the Revankists, a KOTOR Jedi, brought to Revan's attention the absence of his species from their home planet, and the Revankists headed to KOTOR to investigate. In the meantime, there was a lot happening on the warfront. The Mandalorians had Terrace under siege, but were acting to secure the surrounding area to cut off any interference from the Republic, along the northern rim, including Ord Mantell, and a number of Zabrak colonies, including their homeworld of Iridonia, which they occupied and recruited several Zabrak to their ranks. Reaching further towards the core worlds, the Mandalorians set their sights on the planets Wayland and Jebel, where they set up another forward operating base to launch an attack on Alderaan. Poor Alderaan just cannot get a break. On the way, they went to Duxon, gathered their forces, and took control of Onderon, putting it back under Mandalorian control. At this point in the conflict, there was never a more looming threat of the Mandalorian invasion of the core worlds, with them having a couple planets in the mid-rim. The Republic finally decided to start taking the situation seriously, and the Galactic Senate mobilized the entire Republic Navy to counter the Mandalorian threat before they reached the core worlds. Being one of the only fleets that was able to keep the Mandalorians in a stalemate, Captain Saul Careth was promoted to Admiral, and was sent to the planet Serico, the next assumed target. Here, Careth set up planetary defenses around heavily populated city centers, believing that the Mandalorians would take pause before commencing an orbital bombardment for fear of civilian casualties. Mandalore the Ultimate took that as a challenge to take the Republic to a seminar on how to commit war crimes without remorse 101. At this time, conveniently, Zane Carrick had made his way to Serico, hoping to aid in the war effort against the Mandalorians. The day before the attack, he had a force vision showing him the forthcoming assault and the mass casualties that would ensue. He decided to try to get a message through to Admiral Careth, who ignored him, believing that he was a Mandalorian spy who was trying to cause disruption. Careth ordered Carrick's arrest, but not before allowing Cartho Nassi to attempt to contact Alec, knowing that they had some interaction on Flashpoint, but it was too late. Moments later, the Mandalorian fleet would appear on the edge of the system. Careth ordered their fleet in orbit to bring up their shields and prepare for an attack, but was caught off guard when the Mandalorians fired nuclear warheads around the blockade and straight towards the planet's surface, impacting 27 population centers, killing thousands, and ravaging the planet's surface in the process. It was here that we have our first mention of the protagonist of KOTOR 2, Revankist Mitra Surik, who was on Serico at the time of the attack. She, however, managed to, in the nick of time, get into one of 3 military vessels that jumped out of the system before the attack hit properly. This was a disastrous loss for the Republic, and Admiral Careth was under fire from other admirals for the military's positioning near population centers, and he was pretty well personally blamed for the deaths of the civilians. His fleet was driven back until the Mandalorians caught up to his flagship, called Courageous, where it was boarded. Admiral Kareth and Carth Onasi were able to escape from the hangar, but ultimately the vessel was lost. Mandalore the Ultimate would tell you that he commandeered the vessel and melted it down, and the battle axe that he wielded in the war was made from its hull. But that sounds like a big scary man trying to make a cool story. Admiral Kareth returned to Coruscant, where he attempted to resign from his position as admiral, but the admiral of the fleet refused his resignation, seeing him as a competent admiral despite his miscalculations at Serico. Instead, Admiral Kareth was given a brand new, state-of-the-art vessel called the Swiftsure, and was sent back into the action. Back on Taris, a resistance group had formed that consisted of a ragtag group of gang members from the Undercity and mercenaries. They were fighting on foot against the Mandalorian occupation, which was currently being led by Cassus Fett, who had taken up residence in the abandoned Jedi Tower. By the time the Resistance learned this and had taken up arms to bomb the Jedi Tower, Fett had already moved into the Undercity, where he would fight the Resistance personally. The continuation of the Mandalorian campaign from Wayland found their battle at Mirkur, where the Republic suffered over 2,000 casualties overnight, which was a pretty big loss, but they managed to secure a set of Neo-Crusader assault armor, where they studied it for its weaknesses. This did help them overall, as it helped them fight the Mandalorians on foot. From the victory over Mirkur, the Mandalorians prepared for a direct assault on Alderaan. If you remember Demagol, he had an assistant named Pulsifer, who took up his legacy after he was captured on Flashpoint. Pulsifer, in the Undercity of Taris, found a Sith artifact called the Mirror Talisman, and brought it to Jebel, where he would present it, but not before it bit one of his subordinates. Once again, conveniently in the action, Zane Carrick had been stowed away on his ship along with another Jedi, Celeste Morn, where they discovered the artifact and intended to warn the Republic. But before they could do so, the bitten Mandalorian turned into something foul, a gray-skinned feral creature that would be known as a Rakghoul. Anyone who was bitten by a Rakghoul would eventually turn into one as well, which posed a problem for the Mandalorian outpost on Jebel. Carrick, instead of warning the Republic, got into contact with Cassus Fett, who he told about the situation on Jebel. Pulsifer would lose control over the talisman, which held the spirit of its original owner, as most Sith artifacts tend to do. The spirit would seek out Force sensitives to possess, and found their way to Carrick. However, Celeste Morn would sacrifice herself and become a vessel for the Sith Lord. Under Moon's influence, Morn was able to take control of all of the Rakghouls, which she led to infect all of the Mandalorians stationed on Jebel. After putting her in a stasis casket to contain the artifact's power, Carrick was able to escape from Jebel before Cassus Fett's forces arrived to take care of the situation. And by take care of, I mean do the Mandalorian thing and carpet bomb the life out of it. They stopped the Rakghouls, but this also stopped their offensive on Alderaan, as Jebel was to be the main launch point. Because Carrick stopped this situation from getting any worse, Cassus Fett also owed a great debt to Carrick for his warning, which will come into play a little bit more later. Around this time, the Jedi Council member who most opposed the Revanchist movement, Master Darjander Case, was forced to step down from the Council by the Republic because of a conflict of interest. Years ago, he had fallen for a Mandalorian woman named Varda, who died in the Great Sith War. Following his heart, he went for the Mandalorians, who he believed could have a change of heart. Case took with him other Jedi who would form the Mandalorian Knights, a group of Jedi who would fight on behalf of the Mandalorians. Master Case was replaced by another anti-Revanchist, Lucian Dre, who issued warrants for the Revanchist's arrest. He then planned a coup among the Jedi Order by the Jedi Covenant called Vindication. Vindication was ordered by the Covenant's true leader, Hazan, who had been using the Covenant for his own needs. Hazan seized control of the Republic's blockade around Coruscant by hacking into their tactical computers, with which he used the blockade's firepower to bombard Coruscant, eliminating the members of the Jedi Order who opposed Dre and had been trying to seize his estate before Vindication. The insurrection ended with Hazan's death and the destruction of the Dre estate. The Republic couldn't let it leak that this had been an inside attack, so they used the Mandalorians as a scapegoat and said it was a terror attack. After all is fair in love and war. After Vindication, the Jedi Council went to confront the Revanchists when Master Vandar Tok'er of the Jedi Council personally came to the planet of KOTOR to get them to stand down in their crusade, because of another Force vision he had of the destruction of the Jedi Order and the Republic. On KOTOR, Revan found the mask of the female Mandalorian who stood up for the Cathar and was shot down by her own kind. And upon picking it up, he and the Jedi in the vicinity were enveloped in a shared Force vision, which depicted Cassus Fett committing a genocide against the Cathar. Disgusted by the vision and angry at the Mandalorians, he donned the mask and officially declared that his name was now Revan, and in honor of the Mandalorian who tried to stop her own kind, he would wear the mask until the Mandalorians were brought to justice. Master Tok'er, having shared in this vision, had no choice but to begrudgingly sanction the intervention of the Revankists in the war, though the Council publicly denounced Revan's actions as unwise and hasty. It was hard to justify the involvement in a war based on a vision that they had, since most people wouldn't understand that this Force vision was real and not just a delusion of their religion. Revan came up with a solution to any public unease with the Jedi getting involved in the war. That was to deploy the Jedi as a mercy corps, which was to aid the Republic by acting as standby healers instead of warriors. They were granted that much and were deployed to war. Revan's friend, Alec, was pretty jealous of the fancy new name that Revan had dubbed himself with, and had decided he would don a new title as well, and hastily scribbled an M at the beginning of his name and was now known as Malak. So, Revan and Malak were now in direct command of this Mercy Corps, and they were headed to join the war properly. Revan was able to prove himself a capable military leader in several battles where he and his squad won against the Mandalorians. Their group was less of a Mercy Corps in reality and more of a death squad, hunting the Mandalorians and instilling fear. Zane Carrick, still on his random escapades, was trying to find information about his friend, Jrel, who had disappeared after they saved Carrick from his execution by the hands of his masters. Carrick called in his favor from Cassus Fett for his help with the Jebel Rakghoul situation, arranging for Fett's forces to be intercepted by Admiral Kareth's new fleet near the Ethor system and draw out the slaver known as Dace Goliard. He got what he wanted as Fett's forces began their assault on Kareth to try to finish him off, before drawing out the slaver and jumping into hyperspace, allowing Carrick and Kareth to capture Goliard and learn Jrel's location. This wasn't necessarily important to the war, but it was important to the favor that was called in, I guess, so I figured I'd mention it. By now, the war had been going on for 14 years, and it was now 3962 BBY. Jedi Master George Ander Case, who was forced to forfeit his position on the Jedi Council and had joined the Mandalorians, was hatching a plan to create a legion of Mandalorian Jedi. His plan was to kidnap Jedi younglings from the Jedi Enclave on Dantooine, which was approved by Mandalore the Ultimate, who allowed Case to proceed and train the younglings on the planet Ordo with a group of Mandalorians for backup. Case enacted his plan and continued the assault on the northern edge of the galaxy on behalf of the Mandalorians. This campaign allowed them to take the planet Essien due to a low Republic presence in the area. The Republic didn't know that Case had defected yet, however, and Case was able to trick the local militias, including Zane Carrick, into leading an assault against the Mandalorians, which was, all in all, a ruse. Case acted as the good guy, and before anyone could suspect that they were being led into a trap, Basilisk war droids rained down from the sky on the militia, and captured them with Case's Mandalorian knights at the lead. The militia was forcibly drafted into the Neo-Crusader movement, and they continued their warpath towards Dantooine as per Case's plan. Long story short, Zane Carrick was able to escape again by being slippery, and he was able to stage an outbreak at the Fedacom Relay, where he commandeered a dreadnought and took it towards Dantooine to follow Case and the Mandalorian Knights. The Mandalorian Knights were able to move quickly through the Enclave, securing the students that Case was after, but not before Carrick showed up with his fancy new ship and destroyed their means of getting off planet. Because of this failure, the Mandalorians withdrew their support for Case and his plans to kidnap the Jedi younglings, which Case found out while he was dueling Carrick. With this, Carrick was able to convince Case to surrender, and his knights were put to trial for treason. Because of his repeated heroics, the Republic recognized Zane Carrick as a lieutenant and special diplomatic agent, preaching his use of restraint when it came to dealing with the Mandalorian threat, always trying to find a way out without killing everyone. The Mandalorians, however, backed out of their northern campaign and dropped their support for Case altogether. The Mandalorians focused their efforts elsewhere and gained ground on Ares III, and set fire to the planet's plains, which burned for a decade afterwards, remaining a site that was proof to the Mandalorians' brutality. They had several other victories, including the Kara system and through to the Geyser, Nazri, and Vena systems. After meeting up with the forces from Duxon, they took the Ambria and Zell systems as well. This period was very successful for the Mandalorians and would be known as the Mandalorian Triumph, where they were able to gain a lot of ground very quickly. However, with the Republic in full war mode, they were able to pioneer new ships and droids for their fleets, and this is where the iconic Centurion, Intraditer, and Hammerhead-class cruisers were created. While the Mandalorians were continuing their conquest by capturing the Kelor and Exodine systems as well as Bespin, they moved on to Duro, where they started an orbital bombardment of their shipyards. While this was devastating for Duro, having their shipyards and orbital platforms destroyed, Revan, Malak, and Mitra Surik were able to stop a full occupation by showing up in their shiny new ships, the Intraditor-class cruisers, stopping the Mandalorians from making off with any materiel from the shipyards, causing a massive blow to the Mandalorian war effort. With Revan at the helm of the Republic Navy, they were able to get off the defensive and start taking an offensive stance towards the Mandalorians. Revan spearheaded a campaign to liberate Taris from its occupation, which was successful. He led a Jedi task force through the Undercity, liberating slaves and dispatching Mandalorians. It was there that he saved a young Force-sensitive Cathar named Juhani, who he convinced to join the Jedi Enclave on Dantooine, who was also one of his companions in KOTOR. Revan was able to take victory after victory through his tactical prowess, but not without a cost. His methods were quick and brutal, which gave way to many moral shortcuts. Revan and Malak adopted a policy of victory through any means necessary, which meant using the Republic's industrial might to power through the Mandalorian forces and sacrifice populations doing it. It was not popular, but it was seen as a necessary evil, although this took a moral toll on the duo, giving way to the dark side. Revan and Malak uncovered a ruin on Dantooine from an ancient civilization from the Rakata species, which held a star map, a relic that held partial information of the location of a large space station called the Star Forge, a massive automated factory that used the power of a nearby star to churn out a near-endless supply of ships, droids, and other war material. The Rakata were a savage species, and so the star map locations were deeply seeped in the dark side. Revan began a hunt for the rest of the star maps, seeking the location to the Star Forge to aid the Republic to end the war. Together, they searched across the galaxy and found a star map on the Wookiee planet of Kashyyyk, and learned of another on the Sith homeworld of Korriban. From there, Revan learned of Treyas Academy on Malachor V, a Sith training ground where he and Malak sought more power to be able to handle the Mandalorian threat. They convinced themselves that they had noble intentions doing this to help the Republic, and took what they needed before leaving. Even through this, they hadn't renounced the Jedi Code yet, and would continue leading the Republic Navy against the Mandalorians while searching for the remaining star maps. The Jedi found themselves in a ground battle on Ver 4 for several weeks, where they were able to push back the Mandalorians. They were forced to abandon the planet and regroup on a neutral planet nearby, while one warrior, War Mugen, refused to abandon his post on what would be called Blood Ridge, and held up a fortified position with a handful of other Mandalorians. This small force was able to defend against the Jedi for several days, while mounting a counterattack from other angles. Mugen drew out his plans on a piece of leather cut from his tabard, which ended up being immortalized as a symbol of courage and determination to the Mandalorians. They would end up overrun eventually, but it was a great effort nonetheless. I mentioned before that the Republic, led by Revan, was on the offensive around this time. They were now heading directly into Mandalorian space to head them off, where they took the Vorzid system and took a two-pronged attack to two adjacent systems. They saw a defeat at the Lukadex system, while gaining ground from the Steno system, where they moved to take Elam. Confident in their attack, they pushed further into the Jagas cluster, where they would be humbled. Despite Revan and Malak being on the front lines, Cassius Fett and his forces were able to hold ground and emerge victorious. Fett, infamously, personally boarded a Republic vessel, fighting his way to the bridge and killing the captain. He was certainly a force to be reckoned with. However, the back and forth continued when the Republic's fleet under Revan's command moved to the Althir system, defeating the Mandalorian forces and pushing them off-world, ending the almost 20-year occupation. If you remember, Althir 3 was the first planet that they captured that was important to the Mandalorian Wars. Riding on the recent victories of liberating Mandalorian-occupied planets, Revan decided to revisit Onderon and Duxon to try to liberate them from the Mandalorians once and for all. This was no small undertaking, though, because the Mandalorians had had decades to fortify the moon at this point. It was a costly venture for the Republic, but with Revan at the helm, they had a chance. Revan's plan had battle droids deployed to Duxon to take out the anti-air turrets, so that they could drop forces on the ground, where Mitra Surik led the initial offensive on the ground, with hit-and-run tactics to get a feel for the Mandalorian defenses. The Mandalorians were not unprepared and had set minefields around their perimeters, which eventually took most of Surik's forces. Once the main attack force had settled in, the battle lasted for months. This resulted in higher casualties than they had seen in the war yet, with veterans of the battle saying that the Republic lost 10 soldiers for every one Mandalorian killed. They were too deep in this offensive to pull out, however, so they fought on and eventually took control of the moon, driving the Mandalorians further back towards the Outer Rim. The Republic forces were in tatters, damaged and weakened, but they had to push forward with the momentum that they had. They pushed through the Liana system and forced a confrontation at Malachor 5, deploying all of the ships that they could muster to the planet as bait. Revan knew that they would likely not be able to beat the Mandalorians in a fair fight, so he had a Zabrak engineer by the name of Bao-Dur, yet another companion from KOTOR 2, create a superweapon called the Mass Shadow Generator. The Mass Shadow Generator drew upon the natural mass shadows created by planetary bodies, and the gravitational anomalies at work on Malachor 5 allowed it to cause massive damage to anything in the proximity of the planet. Basically, it took advantage of the planet's gravity and pulled anything in orbit to the surface of the planet. The idea was to gather the bulk of the Mandalorian forces to the planet and take them out in one fell swoop. Revan was late to his own party and was held up by Mandalorian scouts and arrived late to the battle, where a full-scale naval battle was already underway. Meetra Surik, meanwhile, was in charge of getting the Mandalorian fleet in range of the Mass Shadow Generator, which was on the surface of the planet of Malachor 5. The Republic was able to gather more resources than the Mandalorians were expecting, and Mandalore quickly realized that his defeat was imminent. Mandalore challenged Revan to a duel on his flagship, which Revan accepted. Despite his massive stature, Revan was able to overpower him and strike him down. Before Mandalore died, he took off his mask and began his villain at the edge of death monologue, where he came to his senses and realized that this whole war was orchestrated by the Sith, and that he had been manipulated the entire time. In his last moments, he explained this to Revan, how it all started and where it would lead to. To verify his story, he gave Revan the coordinates to Rekiad, where it all began with the Sith emissary. When he died, Revan took the Mask of Mandalore, their symbol of leadership, and took it for himself as to prevent a new Mandalore from being chosen, hoping to scatter the Mandalorians for good. Despite Revan's victory over Mandalore, there was still a massive naval battle happening over Malachor 5, and the Republic was pushing the Mandalorian fleet closer to the planet's orbit as per the plan. The Republic would not hold out forever, though, which prompted Meetra Surik to give the orders to Bao-Dur to activate the Mass Shadow Generator to end the battle, regardless of the consequences. Both Revan and Surik's vessels were out of range, and they watched in horror as both fleets were sucked towards the planet in a massive gravity vortex, causing tens of thousands of deaths within seconds. The Republic suffered many casualties, but not near the amount that Mandalorians suffered, and the once lush and green planet of Malachor 5 was torn apart and became a gray world of craters, downed ships, and death. If you remember in the Star Wars movies, when a great number of people were killed at once, it caused a ripple in the Force that was able to be felt from Tatooine to Coruscant. This was so much worse. So much worse, in fact, that Meetra Surik was forced to cut herself off from the Force entirely to avoid being killed in the resulting shockwave. The sheer destruction caused a wound in the Force, transforming Malachor 5 into a planet that sustained itself off of the dark side of the Force. The fun thing about wounds in the Force is that they can manifest in many different ways. On Malachor 5, the planet basically became a ley line for the dark side of the Force because it already had a relationship with the dark side in Treyas Academy, the Sith training grounds that Revan and Malak had visited before. It could also manifest itself in people, and one such event happened on Malachor 5 as a result of the Mass Shadow Generator. The event saw the creation of Darth Nihilus, who would come into play after the Jedi Civil War in the years to come. We don't know much about him before he was Darth Nihilus, but we know that he was a human male who was on Malachor 5 when they set off the Mass Shadow Generator. While not explicitly mentioned, I'm under the assumption that he was a Jedi Knight who was fighting on behalf of the Revankiss. While Meetra Surik cut herself off from the Force to withstand the trauma from the loss of life, Nihilus opened himself to it. He had somehow survived the Mass Shadow Generator, but was in a limbo between life and death. He gave himself to the Force, literally, feeding off the trauma that was manifesting itself through the wound in the Force. He used the Force to sustain himself and gain strength, but at a great cost. He was cursed with a hunger for the Force, craving it as sustenance like you and I would crave food, and siphoned the Force from living things, be it people or planets. Yeah, planets. He was no joke. Eventually, the amount of raw power he needed to consume wasn't sustainable for his body, and he engaged in a ritual that would seal his spirit inside a mask so that he could live on. I would be more than happy to elaborate on this further in another episode. The Sith that were alive at this time were crazy cool. Anyways, seeing the destruction of most of their forces and their leader, the Mandalorians transmitted their unconditional surrender to the Republic, and the war was declared over. The remaining Mandalorians were ordered to be stripped of their weapons and armor, and dismantle their basilisk war droids, the crutch of their invasion. With the loss of Mandalore and his mask, the Mandalorians didn't choose a new leader and instead scattered into clans, back to how they were after the Great Sith War. The various clans fought amongst themselves for power in an effort to control the Mandalorians, but to no avail. Some clans, up to 100 of them, banded together to try to find the mask, as they knew that that might be the one unifying force to allow Mandalorians to survive. After all was said and done, the Jedi who chose to follow Revan were called back to Coruscant to receive judgment. While they were given the green light to serve as medics, they were not meant to be warriors, and the Jedi Council as a whole did not agree with their methods. Meetra Surik, despite being disconnected from the Force, along with other Jedi, returned to face exile. Revan and Malak refused to return, however, for they still had work to do, seeing as this war was orchestrated by the Sith. Revan created an assassination droid, HK-47, to eliminate threats to the galaxy before they could start another war, hoping to prevent another Mandalorian war. Malak urged Revan to use HK-47 to kill Surik so that she could not spill the beans on their plentiful war crimes to the Council, but Revan saw her as dead already since she had been cut off from the Force. The two set out to Rekiad to confirm whether Mandalore's story was true or not, and there, in the tomb, they found a datachron describing the Sith drama's history and the existence of the hidden Sith Empire, confirming Mandalore's words as true. Before leaving, Revan chose to leave Mandalore's mask in the tomb, hoping it would be forever lost. Revan and Malak followed the datachron and found themselves in Dromund Kaas, the hidden Sith Empire's capital, where they sought to kill the Sith Emperor and prevent him from invading the Republic. Given their history with the dark side during the war, the Emperor was able to dominate their minds and turn them fully to the dark side, anointing them as Darth Revan and Darth Malak, the new Dark Lords of the Sith. They were tasked with finding the Starforge to create an army that was worthy of the Sith legacy, and could overrun the Republic. They would go on to look for the remaining star maps, but not because they were under the control of the Emperor, but because they wanted it for themselves. They found it, eventually, and the Jedi who served with them as Revankists formed the new Sith Empire, which would invade the Republic in 3959 BBY, in what would be known as the Jedi Civil War. They took along with them a number of high-ranking Republic officers, including Admiral Saul Kareth, who would lead their fleets in the conflict. But that marks the end of the Mandalorian Wars. I know that was a lot to cover, and I hope you were able to keep up. It's a fun exercise to get a map of the galaxy and follow along with the systems to keep up with the conquest to see exactly how it happened. But with that, it comes down to this. What did you think? Do you think that if the Jedi involved themselves fully earlier on, that maybe this wouldn't have gotten as far as it did? Or do you think that might have complicated matters? Or do you think that the Republic could have won without the use of the mass shadow generator? I think that eventually, without Mandalore, the Mandalorians would have surrendered anyways, but 'tis what it is. You can find us online at Lord to Death on your favorite social media or podcast websites. And remember, Spotify does have a Q&A section where you can submit any ideas you have for other episodes. Or you can send me a message on Instagram where I am most active. And remember, if a red tentacled man comes up to you and asks you to go tomb raiding, you should probably think twice about following him into a cave. And until next time, see ya.